I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Professor Katrin Sieg. Professor Sieg joined the BMW Center for German and European Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. in 2002. She holds a PhD in drama from the University of Washington, Seattle, and she has received several awards and grants, among them a Humboldt Fellowship, which she used to pursue research in Berlin during the 2001-2 academic year, and a Senior Faculty Research Award in fall 2008, which allowed her to complete her most recent book, Choreographing the Global in European Cinema and Theater. She has also written Exiles, Eccentrics, Activists, Women in Contemporary German Theater, and of course, Ethnic Drag, Performing Race, Nation, Sexuality in West Germany. Her recent research looks at the documentary work performed at an immigrant theater in Berlin. And since 2009, she has been a member of an international interdisciplinary research group examining the Eurovision Song Contest as a site where the new Europe is imagined and performed and becomes available for identification and refashioning. She has organized symposia, film series, and conferences on topics related to contemporary German and European culture, including queer European cinema, shadows and sojourners, images of Jews and anti-fascism in East German cinema, European cosmopolitanism, reframing East German culture, and Afro-German cinema. Her title this afternoon is Dragging Up Bodies in European Museums. Please join me in welcoming Katrin Sieg.
Hello, welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank Pauline Greenhill and Alison Marshall, Brandon University and University of Winnipeg for inviting me here. I very much look forward to our conference. In the summer of 1994, a commission to review German popular theater took me to the town of Bad Segeberg. The small town, less than an hour away from Hamburg, was famous for its Wild West theme park and outdoor theater, which I remembered from my childhood. The annual Karl Festival, named after a 19th century writer of adventure tales whose novels were adapted to the stage, drew over 100,000 spectators each summer season. These plays would celebrate the close friendship between a fictional Apache chief and a German traveler initially and mistakenly accused of racial crimes. In the Wild West Park adjacent to the outdoor theater, children and their families could have some fun around a campfire or learn about Native American cultures in the small museum integrated in the theme park. At the town parade that opens the festival each year, they might also encounter German hobbyists who had for years become adept at emulating Plains Indians' material culture, songs and dances. This hobbyist group, which participated in the festival, yet also saw itself as an ethnologically more accurate corrective to the town's Wild West fantasy, had forged relationships with a group of Winnebago Indians who visited them on several occasions and shared some of their songs with them. In Bad Segeberg, I encountered a variety of practices driven by cross-cultural identification, desire, and appropriation that I called ethnic drag and proceeded to tease out in my book of the same title. They included the professional actors portraying fictional Indians on stage, the children wearing dime store headdresses for a day, and the hobbyists and their sustained efforts to learn and share Indian cultural heritage in respectful and fulfilling ways. The varieties of ethnic drag I encountered at this dense performative site began to form a pressing research puzzle when considered alongside the surge of racist and xenophobic violence that swept Germany in the wake of unification. So this was the early 90s. Afro-German citizens, Gypsy refugees from Eastern Europe, and Turkish guest workers alike were targeted in the street and in their homes. how to reconcile the love for Indians and identification with their cultures that drove ethnic drag performances in Bad Segeberg with nationalist hatred and racist violence. Was there an internal logic connecting these seemingly contradictory phenomena? One of the answers, derived especially from my study of Bad Segeberg, turned on Germans' disavowal of the country's historic involvement in racist violence and genocide during the colonial and fascist periods. Ethnic drag helped me reveal the disavowal in Germans' identification with victims of genocide rather than the perpetrators. It helped me understand the geographical displacement from the Eastern European frontier of the Nazi Empire to the American West. And it helped me grasp the substitution of Indians for Jews, Americans for Nazis, at work in the revisionist fantasies I observed in Bad Segeberg. Understanding drag's disavowals and displacements as symptoms of an unprocessed history of perpetration thus went some way to explain the violent resurgence of nationalism and racism. My critique of these operations served to secure an ethics of remembering genocide and a post-colonial politics of redressing racism. In this endeavor, my book Ethnic Drag contributed to the post-Holocaust pedagogy being institutionalized in the 1990s through memorials, museums, research clusters, and school curricula. These were key components of the expanding regime of cosmopolitan norms and values which sought to fill the ideological vacuum left by the end of the Cold War. This cosmopolitan regime sought to train a white European public in historic reflection and ethical responsibility. These tasks had become newly urgent after the genocides and ethnic cleansings in Rwanda and Bosnia during the 1990s. Holocaust memory has become a powerful engine driving research about past violence perpetrated in the name of nation and race. Beyond excavating the specific history of what the Nazis did to European Jewry, Holocaust memory has mobilized future-directed ethical commitments to never again permit the discrimination, displacement, or extermination of people based on race. The Stockholm Declaration of 2000 enshrined this imperative as binding for all present and future members of the European Union and established January 17th, the liberation of Auschwitz, as the first day of remembrance observed across the continent. The Holocaust derived its power as moral measuring stick for a post-Cold War world from its status as uniquely cataclysmic event. We now witness another tectonic shift as the status becomes contested. The relationship between the Holocaust and the longer history of conquest, colonization, and racial violence is revisited not just by historians and political theorists, but by a broad array of actors and activists. Was the Holocaust an unprecedented rupture in civilization, an evidence of Germany's special path to modernity? Or was it the climax of 5 centuries of invasion, annihilation, exploitation, enslavement, displacement, and dehumanization that was the colonial norm of the European civilizing mission? Can the future-oriented cosmopolitan commitments grounded in Holocaust memory and pedagogy also sustain a daunting look back at the colonial past that now looms much larger and in Europe has been much less rigorously confronted and worked through? And how to carry its ethical lessons forward again into a Europe that has fortified and militarized its borders to prevent entry to refugees, boat people, and asylum seekers from the global south, that shunts post-colonial populations into underserved banlieues, bans minarets and headscarves, patrols mosques, and practices racial profiling, while decrying immigrants' purported unwillingness to integrate and tendency to form parallel societies. And where, at the same time, commodified forms of ethnic cultures, from klezmer music, Turkish hip-hop, and gypsy turbofolk, value difference, but fail to address persistent social inequalities. European ethnological museums have become key places for confronting these questions. As repositories of art and artifacts collected during the colonial era, they now struggle to adjust to the new cosmopolitan narratives. Most museums have now dropped references to ethnology from their names, rearranged their collections, and adapted styles of display to sever any unsavory connections with now discredited scientific disciplines supporting the colonial project. Exhibiting techniques, floor plans, and informational labels no longer evidence the familiar narratives of racial order, evolution, and the civilizing mission. Yet the material remains of accumulation are still there. So are many of the patterns of perception, repertoires of feelings, and habits of thinking and knowing that arguably shored up European superiority long after the empires had fallen. The vast array of things and bodies that European explorers, scientists, soldiers, and traders acquired now poses a challenge to curators and directors. Artists as well have contributed to the debate about colonial remains, sometimes at the invitation of museums, other times in conscious opposition to museum practice. In my presentation, I will discuss a performance installation by South African theater artist Brett Bailey, which has toured Europe since 2010, to think through the remnants of coloniality, the relics of African bodies in post-colonial museums, and the role of the performing arts in this climate of museological self-reflectivity. As a white South African who came of age in a country struggling with the painful legacies of apartheid, Bailey sees the role of the arts as contributing to the agenda of facing historical truths and striving for racial reconciliation. He received his graduate training at the University of Amsterdam, where a research project took him into the archives of Amsterdam's Museum of the Tropics, one of Europe's most significant ethnology museums. It was there he first encountered evidence of German colonial troops' atrocities in what was then called Southwest Africa. The German troops' cruel annihilation of the Herero and Nama in 1904 to 1905 in what is today Namibia has been called the first genocide of the 20th century. Bailey was struck by the amnesia surrounding Europe's colonial past, which contrasts sharply with Europeans' acute awareness of the Holocaust. Quote, "I think in Germany the Holocaust is such a huge block of granite in the viewfinder that remembering beyond that is quite tricky," he said to a journalist in Berlin. The performance installation Exhibit A, which opened in Vienna in 2010 and traveled to Germany and Finland thereafter, not only focuses spectators' gaze on the Herero and Nama genocide, hidden underneath that block of granite. In 2012, he created the sequel, Exhibit B, which added installations pertaining to Belgian colonialism and was shown in France and Belgium. I argue that the Exhibit A and B performance installation sets the block of granite in motion to roll over the cosmopolitan commitments that have cohered around it into a critical reckoning with race in Europe. Exhibit A premiered at the Ethnology Museum in Vienna, which has now renamed itself the World Museum, and many of its 13 silent tableaux arranged along a path recall distinct historical conventions of museum display. They include natural history formats like the ethnological diorama, which features indigenous groups in their natural habitat, and the glass cabinets in which anatomical specimens like skulls, bones, or skeletons might be displayed. Others cite art museum formats that isolate, decontextualize, and elevate objects through lighting, frames, and pedestals. Some of the stations along the parcours confront visitors with well-known persons like Sarja Bartman, who in the early 1800s was exhibited at English and French fairgrounds and in anatomical theaters under the name Venus Hottentot, and the Viennese Freemason Angelo Soliman, who made a career at the Habsburg court. It was skinned, stuffed, and displayed in the curiosity cabinet after his death. These individuals have become icons of European race relations, and their stories have become important rallying narratives for Black diasporic communities. Others are complex theatrical tableaux that capture and condense large-scale violent events, such as the Herero and Nama genocide, and the infamous rubber collection system implemented in King Leopold's Congo colony. These historic tableaux are interspersed with present-day African asylum seekers labeled found objects, whose arms and legs are circled by measuring tapes and whose bodies are accompanied by ethnographic information in biometric data charts. The tapes and charts visually link the anthropometric techniques of 19th century racial science with contemporary regimes of migration monitoring and border control. Together, the exhibit stations assemble an introductory and necessarily selective survey of the European history of race, which foregrounds the representational codes and conventions developed in the exhibitionary complex. The installation intervenes in a historical juncture when much of the story is still not widely known, but when many of the representational conventions encoding coloniality are no longer evident, as museums reposition themselves as cosmopolitan purveyors of a global patrimony in which diversity is valued and violence forgotten. The installation thus insists that decolonization hinges on the critical working through of the historic codes of racial representation, on truth as a prerequisite of reconciliation. This is a risky endeavor which has been criticized for the violence to which it subjects its African performers. Let me take you through 4 of the tableaux to show how the use of live performers from Namibia and from the cities where exhibit is mounted is crucial to this working through. I have not quite made up my mind yet whether the one-sided costs borne by the Africans are worth the insights gained from the installation. When I saw Exhibit B in Belgium last fall, patrons were first welcomed and seated in a room from where we were sent on our way one by one. Taking photographs or making recordings was forbidden, and we were asked to look at the exhibits but refrain from speaking. Early in the parcours, I encounter a large window behind which a box is set into the wall. The gold frame around the window and the sumptuously laid table filling the bottom third of the space behind it recall the still life paintings of the Dutch Golden Age, although they are strangely pale, like an overexposed photo. Precious silver and porcelain vessels and a tall, wine-filled glass goblet to the left complement an abundance of domestic and exotic foods. The human skull at bottom left references the vanitas motif sometimes found in still life paintings. Opposite the skull, 2 notebooks, commonly symbols of learning, are opened to engravings of tortured slaves in the Dutch colony of Suriname, South America. I stepped closer to study the details of the fine engravings when I suddenly become aware of a dark figure, at first barely visible in the shady background. A young black man, his head partially hidden by an antique metal contraption, watches me through a muzzle. On his bare chest, I discern golden initials, a branding mark like the ones used by Dutch slave traders. Because of its color and position, it recalls an embroidered brand logo. Shocked, I shrink from this man's gaze, peering out from behind the hideous mask. The plaque accompanying this exhibit lists a range of punishments meted out to slaves, which boggle the mind with their sadistic ingenuity. One particular incident and the names and gender of the victims are described, one could infer that these stood for more general customs. The opulent still lifes commissioned, owned, and displayed by wealthy Dutch merchants and investors in the 17th century expressed pride in the commodities and luxury items that the Dutch trading companies and their growing fleet brought back from the East and West Indies during the 17th century. Spices, porcelain, tea, tobacco, sugar, and slaves were the top commodities traded in Amsterdam, and displaced the homey loaves of cheese and bread dominating earlier still lifes. In her book, Still Life and Trade, art historian Julie Hochstrasser argues that the popularity of the genre owed as much to its celebration of prosperity as to what it effaces. The still life obscures the true cost of human labor and human life that made possible the development of the first capitalist economy in Europe. While Dutch merchants and investors enjoyed astronomical profits of 400% on cargoes that reached Amsterdam, their Southeast Asian trade partners have suffered enduring poverty to this day. Indigenous populations were driven off their land or indentured. The highest human costs, finally, were borne by the enslaved. As objects of property, African slaves sometimes appear among other commodities in still lifes, but the depiction neither indicates their toil nor hints that it made the riches on Dutch tables possible. Given our own faith in continuous economic growth, it is worth mentioning too that 1/3 to 1/2 of the sailors and soldiers from the Dutch working class did not return from their voyages, resulting in population decline and economic contraction that lasted a century. By eliding the true costs and uneven effects of capitalist development and suggesting that prosperity appeared as if by magic or by divine grace, still life painters gave apt visual expression to what Karl Marx called commodity fetishism. By including a live black body among traded things, Bailey's still life installation reconstitutes the forcibly displaced, violated lives drained from the branded commodities. It literally fleshes out what commodity fetishism masks as a property of the commodity itself, and what the still life genre effaces altogether, namely the alienated human labor power that the commodity absorbs. Whereas Golden Age painters portrayed precious possessions as so engorged with life they made viewers' mouths water, Bailey restores the human labor that produced commodity value by flattening out and leaching color from the objects displayed on the table. Concomitantly, the skull loses its aesthetic aura and becomes legible as an indexical sign of high mortality rates and genocidal violence. Finally, the books are stripped of their abstract status as generalized symbols of knowledge. While most learned Dutch men did not complain about slavery, these particular books, authored by the bicultural writer John Gabriel Stedman about his travels through the Suriname colony, did. Their indictment of the treatment of slaves rejected the racist patriotism and capitalist complicity of Dutch masters and furnished important evidence for the abolitionist cause. The display of Stedman's books among the still life items suggests that abolitionism is part of the problem to be worked through. Scholars on slavery from Françoise Verger to Saidiya Hartman deplore the relations of dependency and the demeaning plea for recognition that abolitionism imposed on post-colonial subjects. Rather than usher in an age of emancipation and equality, abolitionist discourse cemented the dyad of black victim and white savior in the Eurocentric imagination, which continues to haunt the present humanitarian discourse about Africa. Verger has argued that moral condemnation, while certainly necessary, has furnished only a, quote, weak barrier against new explosions of ethnic violence, end quote. The ethical affect of shame it seeks to incite in white viewers is insufficiently tethered to reflections about the ways in which the commoditization of human bodies, organs, and labor persists, and has indeed proliferated not just since the end of slavery, but since the 1980s, when the latest phase of neoliberal globalization commenced. Yet the still life installation arguably duplicates the abolitionist discourse of moral condemnation, shaming, and pleas for recognizing suffering through its presentation of a constrained body and mutely pleading gaze. Moreover, Bailey's decision in the earlier iterations of Exhibit to have African children lead white adult patrons by the hand reinforces an infantilizing interracial and geopolitical constellation. Reparation is reduced to recognition, and recognition is enacted through the exchange of looks. My group includes several Black Belgians, although our isolated perambulation prevents me from witnessing their response to this installation. I can only imagine how grievous and debilitating it must be for them to face the muzzled visage. The still life box heightens my awareness of the racialized division of labor, not just in the Dutch Golden Age, but in this performing installation as well. One of the best-known figures presented by Bailey, and the one with whom Austrian audiences in particular would have been most familiar, is Angelo Soliman. And remember, the whole series started in Austria. Soliman's first biographer, Caroline Pilar, in 1807, framed his colorful life story as one of spectacular upward mobility and transcendence of racial barriers. Born in what is today Nigeria in 1721 and sold in the Mediterranean port of Marseille as a slave, he served several European aristocrats as a hofmoor, court moor, and was eventually baptized, renamed, and freed. A highly educated man, he spent a large part of his life working as a royal tutor in Vienna. Soliman, a celebrity in his day, became head of a prestigious Freemason lodge in Vienna that included Mozart, among others, and befriended several of the city's leading artists and intellectuals. He married and had a daughter and owned the house in which he lived with his family. Pichler's biography, however, left out important details about this prominent public figure's posthumous life. After his death in 1796, Soliman was skinned by a taxidermist, stuffed, and displayed in a curiosity cabinet in the Imperial Natural History Museum. Much in contrast with the elegant attire in which Soliman usually appeared in public, the mummy was outfitted in the grass skirt, beaded necklace, and headdress of a stereotypical savage, and moreover placed in a cabinet furnished with Native American flora and fauna. His daughter Josephine sued in vain for her father's remains so the family could bury him. In 1848, the remains were destroyed in a building fire. In the 1990s, in the aftermath of mass refugee flows, xenophobic backlash, and neo-Nazi resurgence, Soliman was rediscovered. The death of a Nigerian asylum seeker who in 1999 was suffocated by Austrian police during deportation kindled mass protests and a broad coalition of migrant and leftist anti-racist organizations, a coalition that has eroded since then. Soliman's memory became a way to contextualize and orient both the bonds and rifts emerging in Austrian society. He has been the subject of new biographies, several exhibitions, 2 plays, and 1 dance theater piece authored by critically minded white Austrians who seized Soliman for a project of anti-fascist and anti-racist reckoning. These works accord his posthumous desecration a great deal of attention, and read his life largely through the lens of evidences a much-needed attention to the violent operations of racial objectification, which this accomplished man could not escape. But it also locks Soliman in the position of quintessential victim. In 2006, the newly formed research group on Black Austrian history and presence turned to the Soliman family to define its own identity and mission. How could we tell and write Angelo Soliman's story, the group asked. How can the protest of his daughter Josephine Soliman, who fought against the inhuman display of her father in the Imperial Cabinet of Natural Curiosities, be grasped from a Black position, given that she was an 18th century Black Austrian woman? Although publications about these 2 people already exist, they usually depict the position of the white majority, For us, however, it was important to research and work through Black history collectively. The group translated Josephine's legal claim for Angelo's dead body, now unrealizable, into a symbolic reclamation of his life. The form in which they chose to convey their research, aside from the proposal to rename the street and the poster that they created, so the form in which they chose to convey their research was a song titled Let It Be Known, which gave expression to a collective Black Austrian subject and object of knowledge that bridged past and present. Filiation with Suleiman's daughter brought into being an oppositional subject empowered to both mourn the victims of violence and protest injustice. At Exhibit B, I encounter Angelo Suleiman's body placed on a table in a dank, low-ceilinged basement room. The actor impersonating him wears a cream-colored embroidered brocade coat from which spills a fine lace jabot, white gloves, silk stockings, silver-buckled shoes, and an Ottoman turban, finery similar to those in which Suleiman had himself portrayed by the painter Johann Nepomuk-Steiner. A stuffed white pelican is propped up behind him and reminds spectators what lies in store for the body in front of them. The stuffed bird makes the moldy-smelling cellar more clearly legible as a taxidermist's workshop. As a stand-in for the animals that historically surrounded Suleiman's stuffed corpse in the Curiosities cabinet, however, the pelican also signals their shared status as curiosities in the cabinets of wealthy collectors. The performer's dark skin is painted white, making his dark eyes stand out. As I take in his body, note the pelican, and read the accompanying plaque, I become aware of intensely mournful live music from the next room. And I'll come back to this music later on. Bailey's choice to apply white paint to the actor's face serves to distance the historic figure, to underscore his status as representation. In addition, it could be read as a protective layer that interposes a screen between viewer and actor, as if to interrupt the transferal of historical categories of race to Black Austrians performed by the spectator's gaze. The choice of white paint is highly ambiguous, however. On the one hand, it could be seen to insinuate his cultural identification with those who in the end regarded him as a savage, and condemn his efforts to fit in on white terms, a victim of his own false consciousness and misplaced trust. On the other, it evokes some African traditions of covering the face and body with white paint, famously documented in Leni Riefenstahl's photographs of Nuba wrestlers in the Sudan, but also used by Xhosa boys on the Eastern Cape. What might read as classically deconstructive ethnic drag thus introduces the possibility of multiple reference systems in which Suleiman signifies. By displaying Suleiman in his courtly vestments, the exhibit pointedly honors the living man, described as a philosopher, scientist, royal confidant, and prominent Freemason on the placard, rather than reenact the scandal and shame of his postmodern display. It restores his dignity by underscoring his embeddedness in multi-ethnic Austrian society in friendship circles. By staging the moment before his mummification, the actor's living, breathing body serves to reclaim Suleiman's humanity from the status of a soon-to-be stuffed thing. At the same time, the horror of his story is not disavowed. Although the still recumbent figure provides few clues about the protests his daughter launched on his behalf, and about the inspiration he has provided to contemporary Black Austrian activists, the mournful Nama hymn wafting over from the adjacent room recalls the Black Austrian Research Group's choice of an oral rather than visual form of commemoration and grieving. While their perspective is unavailable to Bailey, the Namibian mourning song hints that Suleiman's story is part of a larger diasporic project of remembering and symbolic reclamation. It reminds spectators that parts of Suleiman's biography will never be known. The still but breathing body on the table pulses with the potentiality of a life that continues elsewhere, in the off space of this installation. Exhibit A and B are two installations about the Herero and Nama genocide. The first is located literally at the highest point of the parkour. The second is the last installation before the exit. Walking upstairs, I can hear beautiful singing, 19th century romantic German Lieder. On the balcony overlooking a cavernous ballroom, a large regal woman in African dress and knotted kerchief around her head sits with knees spread apart, holding a shard of glass in her right hand, a human skull in her left. The entire elevated pedestal on which she sits is covered with glass shards. Behind her, high up on the wall, in the installation I saw, a large cross with nails driven into it all the way around. In front of her, to her left and right, two tall wooden posts, barbed wire between them. A German sign attached to the wire warns against electrocution. A shred of clothing near the left pole suggests that someone tried to escape and tore their clothing in the attempt. On top of the poles, African masks that look like human skulls. On the left and right of to the left and right of the pedestal, two human skulls, each in a small glass case. The plaque informs us that in the camps where Herero and Nama, survivors of the genocide, were imprisoned, women were forced to scrape off skin of severed heads, which were then sent back to German museums to furnish evidence for physical anthropologists' racial theories. The sweet, searing music, the woman's posture, and the glittering shards form a poetic image of acute, cruel beauty. Bailey's Station nightmarishly condenses the main ingredients of violence perpetrated by Germans in Southwest Africa into a single stage set. The missionary activities that preceded and accompanied traders, settlers, and military troops. The mass extermination of Herero and Nama, whom German colonial troops drove into the Omaheke Desert, where most died of thirst. The survivors' forced labor in concentration camps, and the scientific afterlife of their skulls for Nazi anthropology. For many visitors, the glittering shards covering the pedestal might have generally recalled the diamond mines where black workers toiled under harsh conditions throughout southern Africa. More specifically, they might be seen to reference the diamond mining company that suggested the use of prisoners for forced labor to make sure the Herero would, quote, not revolt again for generations, end quote. The mortality rate at the Shark Island concentration camp, where mostly women and children were held captive, was 90%. The skull-like masks perched on top of the camp fence I took as a reference to Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, and hence a gesture that embeds the German concentration camp in a larger history of racial violence and exploitation. The skulls in this installation also introduce an argument about continuities of racial violence connecting colonialism and fascism. Skulls, once held as objects in anatomical archives, have not only been reclassified as human remains or as part of bodies traveling in coffins, but they have also become powerful actors in international relations and domestic affairs. About 3,000 Namibian skulls are thought to reside in German archives. In 2008, the Namibian government requested the return of human remains related to the colonial war against the Herero and Nama. In the fall preceding Bailey's installation of Exhibit B in Germany, 21 skulls from the archive of the Charité Research Hospital in Berlin were handed over to a Namibian delegation that had come to retrieve these ancestors' remains. 20 more skulls from Berlin and 20 from the University of Freiburg have been returned since then. At the 2011 return ceremony, for which the Namibian government had flown in a sizable delegation of government officials, Namibian chiefs and spiritual experts, and members of 3 activist committees, only one representative of the German government spoke. While the chairman of the executive board of the Charité Hospital apologized for the, quote, complicity of German science in the colonial enterprise and in colonial violence, end quote, the German minister avoided the terms genocide, apology, restitution, or reparations. When audience members shouted "Apology now" and "Reparations now," the minister left the ceremony to the great consternation of the assembled Namibian delegation. Although no one disputes the facts that today the annihilation of the Herero and Nama would qualify as a genocide, the German government to this day does not recognize the extermination of 75 to 80% of the Herero people as an act of genocide, because the term genocide was not defined as an actionable term in international law until 1948. The government fears that an apology would acknowledge liability and open the door to financial restitution claims. For 3 days following the ceremony, however, the Namibian delegates interacted with a range of civil society, religious, and political organizations in the German public sphere that were supportive of their cause. While the comparability of the Holocaust to the Herero genocide has become the subject of spirited academic debate among historians, to the Herero and to German corporations and the government, the continuity thesis has significant financial ramifications. From the perspective of the Herero, the actions of the colonial troops were comparable in motivation, intent, and effect to the deliberate extermination of European Jewry by the Nazis. The term genocide was coined to describe this crime, for which the German government paid reparations to Jewish individuals and to the State of Israel after World War II. In the 1990s, moreover, German companies were required to compensate forced laborers in Eastern European concentration camps. In 2001, a Herero group brought a suit against Deutsche Bank, which had financed the German colonial administration, a mining company, and the Wörmann Shipping Company for employing slave labor and operating a concentration camp respectively, asking for $600 million in damages. $600 million in US dollars in damages. I think it's not very much. At the same time, the Herero sued the German government for $600 million in reparations. No decision has been reached yet about these suits, whose outcomes will likely have implications for other nations that perpetrated colonial atrocities as well. Reparations are rarely the result of litigation, but tend to be the result of political negotiations. While the Herero view German reparations to Jews as a precedent for their claim, the fact that the Namibian government, unlike the State of Israel, does not act as advocate for this group of citizens does not bode well for their cause. Not only are the Herero an ethnic minority in a country whose ruling party is composed of Ovambo, a rival ethnic group, but the Namibian government opposes the claims of the Herero because it is heavily dependent on foreign aid, most of which comes from Germany. The German government is not alone in choosing foreign aid as a way of recognizing special obligations resulting from colonial exploitation and violence without declaring these indemnity payments. The problem is that foreign aid does not right colonial wrongs. The Herero, most of whom are still cattle herders, hope that reparations for genocide will allow them to repurchase the grazing land taken from them under a colonial law they cannot contest. The return of the skulls furnished them with an important opportunity for making their case not only in front of the German public, but at home. So actually they unloaded the skulls in coffins. The debates about what to do with the skulls are part of the continuing politics of restorative justice in the post-colonial state. To the Herero and Nama, the skulls were not just remains of the victims of genocide, but material evidence of it. They argue that the skulls should be exhibited in the Independence Memorial Museum, which opened this spring, to testify to the genocide in front of an international public, among them many German tourists. And this is the new museum, and the writer's statue next to it is actually an old German colonial statue that commemorates the German victims of this war of annihilation. Equally important, the skulls could teach Namibian children about the heroism of the Herero and Nama's anti-colonial struggle, and thereby rewrite the national narrative according to which resistance to colonialism was begun by socialist liberation movements in the 1960s. There is thus a great deal of power vested in the Herero skulls, which is evoked by Bailey's installation. The power to hold former colonizers responsible for atrocities and sheer greed. The power to restore the dignity and livelihood of survivors' descendants. The power to promote redistributive justice within the post-colonial nation. The power to reframe economic transfers between a developing country and the beneficent donor of foreign aid. And the power to redress the violence colonial troops visited on indigenous peoples elsewhere. I was awed by the possibilities these skulls held. And yet, the figure of the survivor scraping off the skull in her hand and the de-individualized specimens in the glass cases, while mounting the strongest possible indictment of German barbarity, make it difficult to imagine how such racialized abjection could do anything but assault, injure, and traumatize Afro-European viewers. The romantic lieder audible in the background ironize German claims to cultural and racial superiority, but offer no comfort. The final station of Exhibit B, which returns to the Herero Nama genocide, makes the mourning of the dead and desecrated into its central concern. 4 Namibian singers deliver a moving musical performance in Khoisan. The singers' heads, painted a glossy black, are visible above white pedestals covering their bodies, giving the impression of live museum displays. Mounted on the wall behind and over these disembodied singing heads were enlarged photographs of the severed heads of Herero victims. The installation was titled The Cabinet of Eugen Fischer and provided details about the career of this prominent physical anthropologist who lived from 1874 to 1967, who had conducted a study of racially mixed people in Southwest Africa and became a leading racial scientist under the Nazis. He supported the Nuremberg race laws of 1935, on which the South African apartheid laws were later modeled. Although the journal Science regarded him as a war criminal, Fischer remained affiliated with Freiburg University until his death. In the 1950s, he was awarded honorary membership of several professional associations in West Germany. By naming this station after Fischer, Bailey emphasized the ideological continuities between colonial racial science, the Nazi racial state, and post-war German democracy. The cabinet of Eugen Fischer juxtaposes the severed heads depicted in the photographs with the living heads of Namibian musicians. The murdered and desecrated are reclaimed from the visual archive of racial science and endowed with a kind of speech. Like the repatriated skulls, which might soon be displayed on similar pedestals, the singing heads attest to the communicative power of exhibition. Composed to commemorate the genocide, the music consists of soaring hymnal chords punctuated with smacking and clicking sounds from the Khoisan language. Oops. Let me see if I can. To my ears, it conveyed mourning and closure as it worked towards ever-new harmonies. Dramaturg Wolfgang Lanza, who worked on the Vienna premiere of Exhibit A, stated that the final station points towards the future. It envisions the end of accusation or hate. The blocking supports such a prefigurative, utopian dimension because the African actors in the final station no longer face the audience or seek eye contact. They are positioned in profile, and their eyes look towards the right, which in Western visual tradition signifies the future. Finally, we were there long enough to become kinesthetically affected by the exertion and discomfort of the singers who crouched in their tight boxes. The strain of working under these confining conditions induced them to sweat profusely. Beads of perspiration formed and streaked their glossy faces, which were covered in black grease paint. Their sweat-lacquered visages made palpable the labor of mourning and threw into relief how arduous, how painful, and how one-sided this labor has been until now. After wandering through the installation alone and after submitting to sometimes extended, often uncomfortable eye contact with silent performers, I felt comforted by the collective configuration and by hearing Namibian voices expressive of emotions and subjectivity, even if I could not understand the words of their song. This station conjured a future beyond the colonizer-colonized subject-object dyad and evoked an agency no longer directed at inciting shame and guilt, but at aims that will no longer include white Europeans or depend on their recognition. As I have tried to show, ethnic drag retains some usefulness in our present historical moment as a theatrical technique that can contribute to the ongoing work of uncovering and undoing colonial practices, mindsets, and epistemologies. It supports the work of decolonization, which in Europe is undertaken by coalitions of anti-fascist and pro-immigrant groups and forces. But a critique of racial stereotypes or politics of moral condemnation will no longer do if it is not embedded in coalitional networks that take the perspective, feelings, interests, and agendas of indigenous or immigrant groups into account. Post-colonial states like Germany often oppose these agendas. Or like the Namibian state, they reroute the striving for greater political and economic autonomy into institutions of cultural representation. Bailey's performance installation makes some important gestures. It reconstitutes the violated lives that made and make capitalist development possible. It recontextualizes stories of dehumanization and racist objectification. And it resonates with the politics of indigeneity, which I see embodied by the skulls. The use of face paint in the case of Suleiman and the Namibian singers operates not only as purely deconstructive critiques of racial essentialism, but also evokes ritual masking appropriate for collective grieving, healing, and the labor of survivance. In the 1990s, as spaces for the celebratory performance of difference opened up within neoliberal globalization, I could only imagine the proliferating performance of ethnic identities as a form of capitalist commodification and alienation. We are now 20 years further into a multipolar world in which Europe is but one of several centers, and cultures believed to have been extinguished have acquired a second life as heritage, as Barbara Kirschenbach-Grindle puts it. I am more prepared to see globalization, decolonization, and indigenous revival as asynchronous, entangled histories that can no longer be subsumed under one totalizing narrative. Bailey's exhibit series offers one place where we can begin to apprehend the threads of all three of these stories.